I am a research scientist at DeepMind, and I've been working for the past 4 years at DeepMind on navigation. And prior to that, I worked 1 year at Microsoft on a search engine query autocompletion. Before that, I worked for 2.5 years at Bell Labs, doing a little bit of robotics and navigation as well, but in a different way. And before that, I did a PhD at NYU with Yann Lequin in computer science and machine learning. Before that, I did master's and my undergraduate studies in France, where I mostly grew up. So, the concept of navigation is fundamental to research in artificial intelligence, and it is considered at DeepMind as one of the milestones to be achieved on the way to build more and more intelligent autonomous agents that are able to, exploit information from the environment and act in an autonomous way, making somewhat intelligent decisions. And navigation is essentially going from A to B. So it requires any agent to know where they are and where they are going, or maybe how do they get to where they want to go. And those two questions are at the origin of several other questions, and that necessitate for the agent to be able to localize itself and also to do planning. So for instance, where did the agent start? Some of the tasks that agents, and when I say the word agent, I also include humans. Some of the tasks include being able to go back home from a starting position, or being able to estimate a distance from the starting point to the destination, in order maybe to have an idea of how many resources are needed to complete the journey. Also, as I mentioned, planning, being able to plan a shortest path from A to B. One other question that is very relevant for robotics and that enables the so-called loop closure is being able to predict if the agent has been there already before, if the agent is walking on its own footsteps. And finally, the question that all the kids keep asking at the backseat of a car, how long until we get there? So navigation is something that may be innate to many animals who are able to sometimes to outperform humans in that skill. Take, for instance, birds, who dispose of multiple sensors, such as in their ears, they are able to sense the magnetic field of the Earth and to build a map of the magnetic field strength. They also dispose of, in their eyes, of a sort of compass, and they are able to sense the direction towards north. We also have a sense of smell, which we can use to build an olfactory map of the environment. This enables them to travel through extremely long distances and to come back home. Humans, before the advent of smartphones, were also able to navigate. When I was growing up as a child, as a very small child in Zaire, changed names ever since, and then in primary school in Poland, and then as a teenager in France, I was able to find the way to get to school. And I would just rely on landmarks, visual landmarks, and then remember sequences of intersections and streets of how to get there and how to get back. Also, when I was playing as a teenager, Doom, Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, which kind of betrays my age, I trained definitely my sense of orientation and planning and mapping, in addition to other skills. So, yes, we are capable of navigating as well. And navigation, of course, has been one of the main challenges in robotics. I could have shown pictures of the Waymo self-driving car, but instead decided to show pictures of my own work, which is, of course, not as good. So when I was at Bell Labs, I actually worked on Wi-Fi geolocation, and one of the ways we found to automate the process of building Wi-Fi location maps was to use a robot, which we could run overnight in the corridors, hoping that it would not stumble on the stairs. We placed lots of sensors to avoid this kind of situations, and the robot would rely on very cheap hardware, mainly a Kinect sensor, to build to acquire RGBD images, and to build with a 60-degree field of view a depth map, and essentially act like a pseudo-LiDAR. The Kinect works not by time of flight, but by stereo disparity. So it only works up to 6 meters of distance. I was able to combine the IMU, inertial measurement unit sensors, along with depth field information estimated from the Kinect to build, using SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping, maps of the environment, of the office labs in which the robot was driving around. And also, of course, I was able to use it to do particle filter localization. So I think this image here shows a particle filter in action using a predefined map. Basically, you can see where the latest laser range or Kinect sensor measurements have been taken with some uncertainty. And this shows an example of a map being built using particle filters. And on the top, there is the RGB and the depth image of the Kinect sensor. We could even use this Kinect information and RGBD images to actually estimate and 3D reconstruction. And this work has been undertaken by Intel Labs in 2010. And we had an intern, Ivan Mirowski, in our lab, who actually managed to build quite nice reconstructions of the corridors using just the Kinect sensor. So all this apparatus was extremely complicated and time-consuming, and most of the time was spent fine-tuning the parameters of the particle filters, fine-tuning the speed of a robot, and it involved really staying lots of nights in the lab. And one of my colleagues asked me, shouldn't your robot have learned to navigate by now? And at the time, I thought I was almost a little bit offended by this question, because that kind of implied I didn't do my job properly. But no, he was perfectly right. I shouldn't be doing that job. The robot should be learning to navigate by itself. And this was going to be the topic of this lecture. So this lecture is going to be structured in 4 parts, which are constituted by 5 papers, which I co-authored. And first, we are going to look at exploration. So exploration, which means the capability for a robot to go places and to discover as large a map as possible, and simply to find where the target, where the goal is located. And in order to do this, we have approached the problem in the same way as birds have been approaching navigation, by taking advantage of multisensory observations. The second topic will be representation, learning representation of space, which means that we are going to rely on neural networks, and the hidden units of a neural network will contain information, or we hope so, will contain information about the position of the agent in the environment, and potentially about the position of the goal, as well as the distance estimates and direction towards the goal. So essentially, they will be able to learn something about the map. And this work in representation learning is actually grounded in neuroscience, and we have published a paper in Nature about using our technique to replicate work 10 years before about grid cells in the mammalian cortex. The third part of this talk will be about memory. Memory which enables the agent to learn in a new environment which it has never seen before, where the goal is located and what is the structure of the map. And this essentially corresponds to one of the holy grail in artificial intelligence, which is zero-shot learning or one-shot learning, being able to learn on the fly from recent experience. And here, this work on trying to memorize the environment has been applied specifically to this one shot. So it's not zero shot, it's one shot, because the agent has to see it once, of how to navigate in an unseen environment. And finally, and probably the easiest part of the talk will be grounding this to the real world, using observations, photographic observations taken from the real world. All the other work has been done in simulation. This is actually done with real pictures. We are going to rely on Street View, Google Street View, or on pictures taken by a graduate student at a university. And one of the problems we're going to look at is the notion of transfer learning, how to be able to take knowledge acquired in one area, or let's say one city, and adapt it to a new location. So let's start, first of all, with exploration. And in this paper, or actually before I go into the paper, maybe I should talk about a little bit about the technique itself. So as the subtitle of the talk suggested, this is going to be about deep reinforcement learning. So can I just have a show of hands, how many people here know well deep learning? And reinforcement learning? And deep reinforcement learning? Which is, yeah, perfect. Okay, that's fantastic. So I will just quickly give a reminder of this concept. So first of all, you've already heard me saying the word agent multiple times. And that's essentially how I think of everybody, from humans to robots to entities playing games. And so in most of our simulation work, the agent sees this kind of environment. And here I'm actually citing a paper by Max Jaderberg and Wojciech Czarnecki, who's going to give a talk tomorrow on multi-agent reinforcement learning. So the environment consists of Quake, the game, sanitized and stripped of all the controversial aspects like a blood. We just made it look like Tron, the film, by Disney, because all we cared was for the agent to be able to use a 3D environment and to go places. The agent uses that environment to get observations. The agent has a goal, which consists in reaching something that looks like a red floating device. And as the agent gets observations, it can take actions in that environment. The action space that we use consists in moving forward, moving back, strafing left and right, and turning left and right, as well as moving forward while turning left or right. So it's eight actions. The engine itself, because it's based on the Quake engine, has some simplified physics, which means that if the agent does forward and then nothing, and then forward and then nothing, it will actually keep moving forward at a slower speed. And if the agent keeps going strafe left and right, not much will happen, because basically the two actions will cancel out. So as the agent goes around, it will pick up rewards. Those rewards are either 10 points for reaching this red entity called the goal, in which case the agent is teleported somewhere else in the same maze, or picking up apples, which give 1 point. And you can see the agent moving around, taking actions. The agent consists of a convolutional neural network, which is processing the input images, downsampled at a resolution of 84 by 84 pixels. And you can see here the activations of the first and second hidden layer of the convolutional network. Those activations and that convolutional network is actually pretty coarse. It is the same neural network architecture that has been used in most of DeepMind's work on playing reinforcement learning agents, starting from the Atari games, Atari environment. Of course, it's not the same network that was used for playing the game of Go, but we decided to stick with this simplified Atari convolutional neural network, as we called it, because this was one fewer steps in optimization and finding the right architecture. And we know it worked well with Atari games. And so there is this first convolutional layer, the second convolutional layer, a fully connected layer, and then there is a recurrent neural network, long short-term memory, which enables the agent to accumulate evidence over multiple steps and to basically integrate time information. And finally, the agent makes two kinds of predictions. One is a prediction of a value function, which is essentially an estimate of future rewards, the sum of future rewards, and a prediction of the lock policy, of which the action is sampled from. One important element of this deep learning agent is that it also keeps making additional predictions about the environment. And this is what we found was key to accelerate the learning of the agent. So if you think about it, when you go around, you do not only move your limbs and have an estimate of how long it will take you to get there. You also keep making predictions about what's going to happen around you. If you're going to cross the street, you keep making predictions about the state of all the pedestrians and especially the cars and where we are going to be in the next second. And this essentially enables you to avoid an accident. So you make visual predictions, and you also build a model, and you make predictions in that model space of your environment. And our agents will essentially keep making the same kind of predictions. So in the first part, focus on exploration. I'm going to walk you through the first paper that I published in late 2016, Learning to Navigate in Complex Environments, which it was published at the iKiller conference. And this work came out essentially more or less at the same time as other concurrent work at DeepMind on learning to play games in partially observed environments, in 3D environments. So there was a paper by Valadini and Adria Badia, who published early 2016 at ICML asynchronous methods for reinforcement learning, which introduce essentially the partially observed environments such as torques and this labyrinth or DeepMind lab environment. And then there was another paper on making predictions in using reinforcement learning, which was published by Max Jaderberg and Wojciech Czarnecki and Vladimir as well. So our paper focused on predictions that were specifically targeted to the navigation task. So the problem that we're facing was to try to navigate in a maze where the reward could be very far away, and that would entail the navigation, the agent, to try to explore as much as possible the environment in order to be able to be exposed to the reward and to be able to make the association between the shape of a reward and the score, the shape of a goal and the score. And this is a difficult exploration task because the reward might be several hundreds of time steps away if the agent was going in a straight line to the goal. And initially, the agent starts with a random exploration policy. And so the hitting time to get to that reward is very low. So in order to encourage exploration, we can do one thing, which is to place intermediary rewards on the path of the agent that yield maybe smaller scores. So we use those apples. These are extrinsic rewards, which means that they come from the environment, but they were not directly related to the task at hand, which was to reach the goal. And those rewards would provide, even during a random exploration of the agent, with some early feedback that it should keep trying to move forward and exploring new spaces, and basically getting to new state spaces in its representation. Of course, sparse rewards are, using these additional extrinsic rewards is a little bit unsatisfactory, because that means that you need to modify the task that you're considering. And you do not always have the luxury, when you design robots, to do different tasks, to add these extra intermediary rewards on the way to achieving the task. So our alternative strategy was to use predictions. The agent would make two kinds of predictions. One, be a prediction of the depth field immediately in front of the agent. So what this means is that the agent would predict a processed version of the Z buffer returned by the game engine. So it would predict the depth field. And the other task that you considered was the loop closure prediction. What that means is that if the agent goes around the maze and steps back on its own footsteps, it should predict that it's been there already. And you can argue that this is kind of comparable to ants leaving pheromones on the track and then stepping back on their own footsteps and sensing their own pheromones. Finally, one task that you considered for facilitating navigation was learning to make a prediction of the location of the agent. So essentially learning to predict its own position. And that task was used only as a decoding, not as a supervision of the agent itself. So the way you can see it is as if we were trying to train an fMRI decoder on the brain of an agent, but not modifying what's going on inside the agent. So just trying to read the position of the agent on the maze. And maybe I can show a video of the agent in action. So you can see here the simplest maze, which is called the I maze. The goal can be in one of the 4 alcoves, and it's hidden behind a corridor. So the only way for the agent to figure out where the goal is to really explore the I maze properly. And you see in blue the trajectory of the agent during exploration, and then all the subsequent trajectories go straight to the goal. And the position of the goal would change from one iteration to one episode to the other, but during one episode it would stay fixed. So the agent would need to rely on visual cues to be able to go back. Here now we are showing the trajectory of an agent going to the goal in a small and a large static maze, where the goal is always at the same position. And so you see that the agent is really nailing it. And also, it is perfectly capable of decoding its own position. So this blue square here represents the probability estimate, and it's an image that's, I think, 10 by 20 of the position of the agent. Initially, it's all over the place until the agent acquires evidence, visual evidence of where it is, and then that blue square is the distribution of the prediction becomes acute, and the agent can predict its own position. When you watch the value function, you see that it tends to become large when the agent is facing the goal. However, something that's kind of disappointing is that that value function becomes large only when the agent physically can actually see the goal appearing on the screen. And the last thing that I was showing here on the video was the prediction of the depth field. So what we would use for predicting depth would be a quantized image of 8 by 16 pixels, super pixels. In order to provide with more gradients, information to the agent, instead of trying to regress a single image, we would actually make a prediction at every pixel. So we would have a probability estimate for every pixel of how close the obstacles are. Voilà. And the agent is, we can skip the video. So, yeah, the agent would evolve in this environment, yielding +10 rewards every time it would see the red floating goal, +1 for apples. These are the different sizes of environments under consideration. And if you want to try it by yourself and train your own agents, you can use the DeepMind lab, which is available on GitHub on the DeepMind website. So, looking now at the architecture of the agent. The base architecture would consist of only a convolutional neural network fed with images. That would mean that the agent would essentially have a purely reactive policy. It would only base its decision based on the current image. And that can be enough for playing Atari games, such as Pong, where you just need the last 2 frames to estimate the direction of a ball. But of course, it's not sufficient for navigating the maze because there are lots of uncertainties and ambiguities in each image. The second agent under consideration was the one which also includes an LSTM, a long short-term memory, a recurrent neural network. And so at this point, maybe I should walk you through the training algorithm, which is the deep reinforcement learning algorithm. So it's called the Advantage Actor Critic, and that's a paper published by Vlad and Adria in 2015-16, Asynchronous Methods for Deep Reinforcement Learning. So the agent gets to observe the state, which are these images processed by a convolutional network, and we'll call it the state S, and it will take an action A at each time step. And this action will be determined by sampling from the policy pi, which is conditional on the state and on the parameters of the agent. And the agent also keeps making an estimate of a value function, which is essentially the sum of discounted expected rewards, future rewards. And the reinforcement learning itself consists in trying to maximize the log probability of the agent, the log probability of the policy of hitting the right action. So of course we don't know what the right action is because this is reinforcement learning. So the only way to give a weight to those actions is to compute the advantage function. And the advantage function is computed as the sum of discounted rewards, of discounted future rewards, with coefficient gamma. So they are exponentially discounted, plus the future value reward after a certain number of steps. So we typically use k equals 50 steps in our optimization, minus the current estimate of the value function. So this is a baseline that we are trying to beat when training the agent. And yes, as I said, the optimization of a policy term consists in in maximizing the gradient of the log probability of the policy weighted by the advantage function. So our contribution consisted in adding those extra predictions to the agent. The first one was predicting depth, and the second one was predicting loop closure. But after extensive testing of various hyperparameters and seeing which auxiliary tasks were providing with higher rewards, we decided to stop with just depth prediction. The agent has additional extra inputs consisting of a previous reward and of the current velocity of the agent. So you can see it as information coming from the inertial measurement unit or our own vestibular feedback when you talk about human agents. It also knows what action it took in the last time step. And so the images processed by convolutional network are fed to the policy LSTM, just like here, combined with velocity and action. And that policy LSTM makes the predictions of value function and policy. But also, we have introduced an additional LSTM in the middle, which enables to have a hierarchical structure of that agent, and which enabled the agent to learn to memorize the position of a goal in small mazes. Because, so it essentially was able to achieve the so-called meta-learning, learning on from one single episode. That LSTM would generate predictions of depth, and we also tried generating predictions of depth from the policy LSTM. And in our studies, we just evaluated which combinations of predictions were the most fruitful for the navigation task. So, if we compare the reward over time, this is about 100 million steps of training, 100 million frames of experience of the agent. The red line corresponds to a purely reactive feed-forward policy, just a ContNet. And it doesn't achieve high rewards at all. Then we can see in violet the agent that has an LSTM, which is able to integrate evidence over time. And this agent takes much more time to learn an optimal behavior to get to the goal. Whereas if we add auxiliary tasks, the learning is really jump-started, and our hypothesis is that those auxiliary tasks provide with early gradients to the neural network, which helps to train representation in the convolutional neural network processing the images. And so if representation of the convolutional neural network works well, then it's easier to train the policy. One of the questions that's typically asked is, since we have extra information, can we just use extra information as an input to the agent, rather than using it as a target for predictions? So we compared feeding depth field as an input to the agent in light green versus trying to predict depth. And this is actually a different, I think this is a different maze. And what we see is that feeding the depth underperforms when compared to trying to predict the depth, not having the depth information. So what this means, what this suggests, is that the representation of the agent, when it has to make both a prediction of a policy for navigation and a prediction of a depth field, basically gains some extra information from the prediction of the depth, because that depth maybe encapsulates information about collisions, so maybe it can help the agent to avoid collisions, detect obstacles. And also there is this extra contribution of training the agent early with additional gradients sent to the neural network. The way that this training works is that the gradients coming from multiple loss functions, are combined and simply added. And the neural network is optimized with respect to multiple losses. And different parts of the network are adapted at the same time. We looked a little bit at the behavior of the agent in small and large mazes. And we noticed that we managed to, so first of all, we managed to have a good behavior when the agent would come back to the goal, once it would acquire it once, in a very small maze. This was also mostly the case in larger mazes. However, we noticed that when we made the maze relatively large, quite substantially large, and we kept randomizing the position of the goal, the agent was no longer capable of remembering the position of the goal during an episode. And this plot here shows the position decoding during time. You can see initially the estimate of the position, agent position is very imprecise. I mean, it's completely all over the place. And as it acquires evidence during the navigation, the estimate is much more precise. So, we noticed in this early work that we managed to encourage agents to do exploration, but our representation was probably not yet optimal because it couldn't remember the position of a goal over long distances. And the follow-up work, which we started also at the same time in 2015, was in trying to look into neuroscience and trying to understand how all the insights we gain from training agents to navigate simple mazes can be informed and also inform what we know about the neuroscience of navigation for rats. So this work resulted in a publication in Nature called Vector-Based Navigation Using Grid Representations in Artificial Agents. And before I delve into that paper, maybe I should tell you a bit about path integration in robotics. So path integration is essentially a way of tracking the position of a moving agent. We start from an initial position, x0, y0, on let's say in a Cartesian space, and an initial orientation, theta 0. And then as the agent, let's say the mouse in a maze, moves around, we collect, we can keep updating an estimate of its position. So we have xt, yt, and orientation theta t at time t. And at every time step, we have information about the velocity of the agent, the angular velocity, and also the forward and sideways velocity of that agent. That velocity is expressed in egocentric coordinates. So velocity u will always be in the direction which I am facing, whereas x and y are in a Cartesian space. And this is the mathematical formulation for path integration from egocentric velocity. So essentially, we need to keep updating the estimate of the orientation and position using the past estimate of the orientation, theta time t minus 1, expressed in this rotation matrix, plus multiplied by the velocity. So how does this work in rats or in mammals in general? In the 70s, John O'Keefe and Jonathan Dostovsky discovered the so-called place cells, which sounds quite amazing. So rats implanted with electrodes demonstrated this very peculiar behavior that some cells in the entorhinal cortex, in the hippocampus, were distinct for a specific location in space. And that was irrespective of the orientation that the rat would take. So for instance, this black trajectories represent trajectories of a rat moving around, and red are the dots corresponding to the firing field of a specific neuron in the hippocampus of that rat. And different neurons would correspond to different place cells in different firing locations. In the 90s, researchers discovered, neuroscientists discovered that there are also called head direction cells, which are like an internal compass for rats. And they are not necessarily aligned magnetic north, and they can be reset. However, if a rat keeps turning on itself, the same cell would fire only if a rat is facing a specific direction. So those were orientation specific. And finally, in 2004, 2005, Edward Moser and Finn published a paper, and the student Finn published a paper on the presence of grid cells in the entorhinal cortex of the rats. And later it was demonstrated that the same cells are present in the mammalian cortex in general, including humans. And those grid cells have a firing field which is also non-orientation specific. However, this firing field doesn't happen for a single location in space. It happens on a regular grid, a regular hexagonal grid. And so this animation shows a rat moving around and the location of firing of a single neuron. And that would be the pattern. And different neurons would correspond to different scales of firing. Also different orientations of that grid and different offsets. And using a combination of those grid cells would essentially be akin to taking a Fourier transform on a signal and reconstructing the signal from this individual basis. So maybe there is some linear relationship between the grid cell activity and place cell activity. And that hypothesis was what we tested in our work. So the way we proceeded to do this was to actually train an agent to do path integration. So we started with some position, Z0, and an initial estimation of the direction, C0, and we just let the agent go around and kept making a prediction about the position of the agent. The input consisted only of velocity and of the initial position and orientation. And the estimator was an LSTM. The prediction task was very simple. We just plugged a linear layer on top of the LSTM to make a prediction from the hidden units of LSTM to the place cells and some equivalent of head direction cells. And we expressed those place cells in the following way. So for place cells of a position, we basically fitted circular Gaussians all across the space, because this essentially is a bit like places work. The field can be modeled by a circular Gaussian. So those Gaussians have different centers and different spreads. And for head direction cells, we simply fitted the circular equivalent of the Gaussian distribution, which is the von Mises distribution. And that was it. That was our simple prediction task, feeding velocity as an input, starting from a position of the original position of the agent, and just keep trying to make a prediction and adjusting using simple supervised learning the place cell and head direction cell. And this worked very well. In a way, you would expect it to work well because I just showed you an equation earlier which was nonlinear, but it's probably learnable, so it's probably easy to train. We noticed, so one thing that we noticed is that when we are training that numerical integrator to predict the place cells and the head direction cells, what happened is that the activities of the hidden units in the LSTM behaved in this weird way by exhibiting a regular grid pattern. And we noticed that if we made the the model sparse by enforce sparsity by using dropout, which is basically forcing, for instance, with a probability of 50% hidden units to be silent from one time step to another. In that case, so that sparsity constraint was enabled representation that was learned, like a regularization, to become very sparse and also display this grid cell-like behavior. So this was the subject of our publication. We also looked at using this grid cell representation as an input for a reinforcement learning trained agent and to see if this would help the navigation capabilities of the agent. So we need to cite this point that there are other papers in a kind of related work. So first of all, there's Michael Milford, who has been working on rat SLAM, using models of grid cells and place cells for SLAM in robots. And then Cueva and Wei published, when our paper was in review, this paper at iClear, using exactly the same idea, but they didn't obtain hexagonal grid cells, but they managed still to obtain something that looked like grid cells. So, looking at the activations in the linear layer of the LSTM, this is what you would see. Each of those squares on top represents the activity of a single hidden unit of an LSTM over space. So the way we measure it is that we have the agent go around a space and you just sum the activity at that specific output. And we see that this activity displays a grid pattern over space. And we can use a spatial autocorrelogram to see the correlation, the spatial correlation of that activity over space. And this is the tool that's used by neuroscientists to quantify rate maps in rats. And this definitely has also a hexagonal pattern. Not all the hidden units display that behavior. So some hidden units only react, let's say, at the border of a maze. And other hidden units do not have a specific spatial behavior. However, if you look at the bottom plot, most of the units that have a grid cell behavior fire indistinctively of the orientation of the agent, with the exception of this one, which was not location specific, but was orientation specific. It would fire specifically for one direction. So maybe this could be a head direction cell, and the other hidden units would be these grid cells. And using tools from neuroscientists, the first authors on this paper proved that those grid cells obtained computationally have the same distribution of scales as the grid cells observed in nature. And these are two illustrations. This is the activity of the rate maps in rats, and this is what was shown in the LSTM. So this work, this initial precursor work, was only to show that you can obtain grid cells. But of course, a rat or an agent, a robotic agent moving around, does not only have velocity inputs. It also has visual inputs. And this enabled us to do away with an initial estimate of the position. It would just keep feeding the images to the LSTM through central ConvNet. those images actually would be randomly set to black. So to be almost like a rat walking around, mostly with its eyes closed, and from time to time opening the eyes to get a new estimate of where it is, and then walking around. And well, I mean, you can try it at home, it works. You have your own vestibular system that enables you to keep track of where you are as you move around. And that was our agent architecture. And we obtained, again, the same grid cell behavior. And finally, we created a reinforcement learning agent to do exactly that task. This time by adding a policy LSTM to make predictions of value function and policy, and using the outputs of the grid cell system as inputs to the policy LSTM. There was a little bit of, so this by itself was not enough for the agent to train to remember the location of a goal when it would change that location randomly from one episode to the other. So one idea that was had by one of the researchers, and that was actually related, kind of modeling what is done, had some neuroscientific background, grounding, was to do the following. When the agent would go around a maze and it would see the goal, which would yield a high reward, the grid cell activity would be frozen and copied and kept in memory. And then when the agent would restart from a different position, the other grid cell activity, the current grid cell activity, would be compared to that copy. So basically, it's like, you know, you walk around and you know exactly in which state you were when you acquire the big reward. And so you know to which state you're tending to, which state you want to reach. And so that specific copy was crucial and fundamental for the agent to be able to essentially make a comparison between the two grid cell codes. And the cool thing is that, as I'm going to explain in 30 seconds, is that you could actually even fit a linear decoder of orientation and distance. So essentially that difference would translate into a Euclidean metric space. But first of all, I need to mention that using this grid cell agent actually enabled us to train difficult tasks, like this one, on a large maze, where there would be doors closing and opening at times. The goal would be set to a random position from one episode to the other. And so during one episode, the agent would only would have some time to acquire the goal, and during the rest of the episode, as it would respawn somewhere, it would try to exploit the information and come back to the goal, and then to be transported to a new location with a new goal position. So a different layout of a maze and a different goal position. And again, it would have some time to acquire the new goal position, explore the maze, and get the new goal position, and then during successive respawns within that same maze, it would exploit that information. And that grid cell agent was the only one that was able to achieve superhuman performance. So when I say superhuman performance, it's because at DeepMind there are several people who are basically paid to play video games all day long, and who establish they are really expert professional players, and they establish those performances that we try to benchmark against. So, as I mentioned, because we have grid representations at the current position and at the destination, we can actually literally fit a predictor on top of those two concatenated vectors and predict Euclidean distance to the goal and the allocentric direction. So direction to, here from the agent position towards the goal. And finally, one cool thing was that the agent displayed shortcut behavior, which meant that in a maze where there would be initially all those doors would be closed, the agent would end up trying to to cross the doors, and then it managed to reach the goal only after going around through door number 5, which was open. And in the rest of the episode, if the doors would be open, the agent would not go there. It would go straight to the goal, even if it would not see the goal. So the only way for that would be that the agent was actually able to build a spatial map, as we just showed before, of where the goal is with respect to its own position. So it knows that the goal is somewhere around the wall, but if there is a door opening, I might as well just go straight through the door. And the other so yeah, here I guess I'm comparing. Yes, the green one is the grid cell agent. Initially, these doors are closed, so the agent goes around. Then the door opens, the agent goes straight around. And the other agent that didn't have those grid cell apparatus would not display that behavior. And finally, the cool thing was that the Nobel Prize winners of the original grid cell paper approved of this work, which was nice. And they found it was a way to use computational models to justify something, to prove something that exists in biology. Okay, so I talked to you about presentation. I have also mentioned this idea of memorizing the position of a goal. And this is actually quite important for good navigation. So far, we're not able to do it properly in our first paper. And here, in the second paper, we needed to use a hack, which was literally by making a copy-paste of the goal, presentation of the goal, to compare to. In this follow-up work, we actually managed to achieve one-shot navigation in an unseen environment, which meant that the agent would learn to read-write to a memory during an episode where the goal was located. And so that paper was authored by Greg Wayne, Chen Hung, David Amos, and many others. And it consisted in taking the existing structure of the agents, so using sensor inputs, and then building a presentation. You can see it as a form of compression of the inputs. And then memory, that is essentially just a long short form to memory, so a recurrent neural network, that just integrates over multiple time steps, and making predictions to control. So that's the baseline. The first modification consisted in making better predictions using variational autoencoders, actually sequential variational autoencoders, because we would rely on an LSTM enrolled in time. And this is sequential variational encoders having published previously by Greg Wayne and Carl Gregor in the algorithm DRAW, a recurrent neural network for image generation, and also in a recurrent latent variable model for sequential data from a different team. And finally, the second modification we made, which was crucial, was to rely on dynamic neurocomputers. Differentiable neurocomputers. So differentiable neurocomputers of this other algorithm published by Greg Wayne in 2014-15, which was initially called neural Turing machines. And these are neural networks that literally have a tape, so like a Turing tape, and the agent trains itself to read using an attention mechanism, an addressing scheme, to write to a specific position on that tape, and also to read from a specific position on that tape. And the way this is achieved is by using this attention mechanism, which consists in comparing some key that is generated to the contents inside the memory, and reading from whatever is addressed using that attention mechanism. So the Merlin agent would not only use an accumulation of evidence over time to drive its policy, it would actually learn to read from a tape, and that means that it could not only look at the last value of a state vector, but also look at the previous values of a state vector, including the state vector at the beginning of the episode, or the state vector when the agent actually reaches goal. And now now we can do something even better. We can not only store the representation in that memory, the representation of the observations, we can also store the rewards. This is great. The agent can actually look at its memory and see when it reached and it achieved a high reward, and use that to drive its policy. So the architecture, this is the architecture we've been discussing so far in the first work. Just an encoding of the image fed to a recurrent neural network, the policy, predicting actions. One possibility would be to have a memory, a read-write memory, addressed by the recurrent neural network in the agent to fetch information from. And the one introduced by Greg Wayne and others in the paper Merlin, they took advantage of additional variational autoencoders to keep making predictions of a latent variable and using making updates from that latent variable using observations from the environment, and then having a policy depend only on the memory and on that latent variable, and no longer on the immediate inputs of the agent. I think that for the sake of time, we can skip this graph, for which I can say that there are probably 3 people in the world who know exactly what is on this. It's the 3 first authors on the paper. That if you, okay, I'm just going to tell you that if you're interested in variational autoencoders and in state-space models, what happens here is that, do you know Kalman filters? A little bit? Okay. So basically, it's what used, Kalman filters or particle filters, or those algorithms used for localization in robots. What happens is that there is a state, internal state, that's being updated all the time, and you can make predictions in the future. And then you compare those predictions to the actual observations, and you update your state based on those observations, and you keep iterating. And so it's the same principle that's underlying this Merlin paper. And it's illustrated here. The dynamical model of the agent keeps making a prior prediction of what is going to be to see, and you can see that it's a bit fuzzy, it's not very precise. Here we have different images for different weights given to the variational autoencoder of a policy. This is the actual observation, so you see that it's precise. It's acute, because it's the actual images observed. And then this is the posterior state after the end update from the observation. And this posterior state is what is stored in the memory, in the differential memory of the agent. So that agent was able to learn only in one shot navigation in a maze. It's the one that achieved the highest rewards. Interestingly, it also displayed the behavior of exploiting maximally its knowledge, so which means that the time it would take the agent to return to the goal was much reduced after the first experience. So it would spend a lot of time exploring the maze to get the goal. And then when it would respawn somewhere in the maze, it would know how to get back to its position and do it in a minimal time. Whereas the other agents that didn't have this memory apparatus, or even the one that didn't have variational autoencoders, did not have a similar behavior. And that means that we just learned a good policy to explore well, but that doesn't mean that they were able to remember where the goal really was. And the same here, this is a plot that shows the error in the prediction of the position of a goal in an allocentric representation, which means that the agent was actually able to predict on a Cartesian space exactly the position of a goal. This was possible because the environments were pretty small, 15 by 15 squares, and because they had a skybox around it. And so if you think about it, if you know the skyline of Warsaw and you know where the Warsaw Spire is, from one single image you can already predict which direction you're facing. Well, not really, right? Because it depends on where you are. But then in the maze. But then if you have some additional information coming from the, oh no, sorry, that's a bad example. In our case, all the landmarks were outside at an infinite distance. That's the thing. So it's as if the environment was a small pen in which the agent would evolve, and will be distant mountains. And so when you see a mountain in the distance, you always know where it is, in which direction you're heading. It's like the direction of the sun at noon. You know that it's facing south. And so the agent would learn that quite easily. And then it would also learn its own position on a 2D maze of small size, because, for instance, if it would see a long corridor in front of it and some space on the side, that would mean that it could only be in that part of a maze. Otherwise, it would be impossible to see a long corridor, to see lots of space in front and on the side. Okay, yes, also that agent was able to do a good prediction of the value function and other returns. And we can show a video of the agent going around, first exploring the maze. Then acquiring the goal, and you can see that the value function estimate basically behaves like an exponential all along the trajectory of the agent. So it knows where it's going. Okay, so I think at this point we have walked through all the most math-intensive bits of the presentation, which is great because we can focus on the fun bits with navigating in cities and university campuses. The agent behaves like a sort of elephant. It's able to accumulate memory, information about the environment, which is fantastic. That's what we are heading towards. And it's able to navigate in synthetic environments. However, these are only so even if these are 3D, first person, partially observed with procedural variations, there is something limited about them, is that they are not real. And the distribution of possible images in which an agent can evolve is much larger. So we have decided to bring photorealistic environments for the agent. No, it's a joke. We have decided to use Street View, Google Street View. And here we are looking at the problems of modularity and transfer learning. So in this paper published at NIPS, literally a few weeks ago, we learned to navigate in cities without a map. So what that would essentially mean is that the agent would only be given images from its environment and a representation of a goal, like an address to which it has to head to, and that would be it. And it would have to learn to explore the environment by itself. Instead of using synthetic observations and mazes, we switched to Street View images and actual street graphs. Google Street View images are typically acquired every 5 to 10 meters. So it means that between any intersection, there may be lots of positions. And in order to transform this into a reinforcement learning environment, what we did is that we took the panoramas and just like in Street View, we would crop them and we would use projective geometry to project them with a limited field of view. We would actually use 60-degree field of view, horizontal and vertical field of view. And again, we use the same size of the images, 84 by 84, because we wanted to keep our exploration of possible architectures as limited as possible, and we use the same architecture as we use for Atari games, and it worked. The action space consists in 3 possible movements going forward, which is possible only when you're facing a panorama in front of you, and that means that you're facing a street that leads you to that other panorama. If you're facing a different direction, nothing happens, and you take that action, nothing happens. And the other actions would be turn left and turn right. The environments we considered were New York, London, and Paris. We defined those different areas, which would contain between 7,000 to 30,000, 35,000 panoramas. So these were pretty large graphs in general. We didn't consider New York in totality, but this area alone would be 300,000 panoramas, but we defined multiple sub-areas. And we used that to train, to try transfer learning, training from some areas to another, and transfer to another one. And this data set was used for a Courier task. So the Courier task consisted in the agent being fed only with visual observations and representation of a goal. Representation of a goal would be either latitude, longitude, or a distance to nearby landmarks, which were defined by me simply spending some time on Google Maps and picking up places I liked. No, these were my landmarks. Okay, so I studied at NYU, and this I think is the current institute over there, the Computer Science Institute, and this is Joe's Pizza, and this is the Independent Cinema, and this is another independent cinema, and this is a nightclub, and so basically I just picked those places. These were landmarks. So they were not necessarily visible. These are literally just pins of the map, nothing else. And we can represent the position of the agent by computing the distance to each of those landmarks. And then to normalize it, we can take the softmax of minus that distance. Okay, so the agent would never be told its position. It would never be told where it is. It would only be told where it has to go. It would have to learn to localize itself. But in a way, this is pretty easy in a fixed environment. This is what we managed to do as children when growing up without smartphones. Just by exploration and trial and error. Well, some of you grew up without smartphones. Am I really that old? Okay. So that environment is available for your experimentation. The code to access the engine will be available. It's still a 404 link because we are fixing up some last bugs. But it will be available at github/deepmind/treatlearn. And we have released the entire set of panoramas from Street View, an entire set of 113,000 panoramas for 2 cities, central Pittsburgh and this bit of Manhattan, South 81st Street. After having manually verified that no panorama contains license plates or faces, just to be sure, even if there is a convolutional neural network that already went through that. The reason why we took all those precautions is because, unlike Google Street View, you cannot easily remove and replace a panorama once you give it to a researcher to download. Voilà. But if you go on this website and you send a form and you agree to replace your data when there are some updates, when somebody complains that they don't want a face or not a face, but there won't be a face, but they don't want a house to be there, we will update the dataset. So the architecture, we actually reverted back to very simple architectures because here we didn't really need to use any memory. We just had to memorize. It was essentially a memorization task of the environment, but with a very difficult exploration. So we compared the plain ConvNet and LSTM with a hierarchical LSTM making a prediction of direction towards north, what we call the CityNav agent. And in order to make this task tractable, because the goal could be 500 or 600 steps away, we introduced a curriculum learning. So what this means that you would start with the agent initially given a destination that we may be 500 meters away, so it had a higher chance of randomly stumbling upon it using random exploration. And then as it would acquire that knowledge, we would grow the environment. And we would grow the distance to the goal, up to 5 kilometers. So here you see over London, initially the agent has a goal always picked in a small area around it. That's a field of view of the agent. And then at a later stage, it can be much further away. And this definitely worked. And what we noticed is that having a hierarchical structure and auxiliary predictions of heading towards north in those two curves definitely helps to train the agent to achieve a performance that was not perfect. So this is the oracle performance, which above here, which will be determined by a shortest path algorithm, which would entail that the agent would have access to the map. It was not the case. And I think we can see some images of the agent going around. So this visualization is not done using 84 by 84 images because that would be a little bit crude. We just recomputed the trajectory. Using the same trajectory, we just recomputed the images using a larger field of view. Is there a question in the back? No, as you noticed, right? Yes. So actually, many people ask that same question. But just as we tend to notice miracles more often than we notice non-miracles, I think the probability of this agent going against the traffic is exactly the same as going with the traffic. Just we notice one and not the other. What happened is that we are using an undirected graph. And so the agent can move forward or backward. And lots of streets are unidirectional. But yeah, we didn't use, obviously, any directional information. So the same trajectory in London, and you can see that the agent picked multiple destinations, one after the other, and managed to cross bridges and get there. And yes, as I mentioned, we also trained in multiple environments. The idea was to train on 4 cities, or 4 areas, and then to try to retrain a subset of the agent in an unseen area, exploiting information that we acquired in these 4 other areas. So we try to do some transfer learning. So here we're just showing navigation in New York, but now we're trying to transfer to Lower Manhattan, and this worked again. And we're going to explain you how we did this. Okay, I think we're just going to let the agent go towards the Hudson River. Maybe I should, at this point, explain that the action space of the agent was, so as I said, going forward, if it's possible to go forward, but in most cases it was not, because the agent would just waste an action. And the rotation would be by 11 degrees, or 22.5 degrees. We tried different angles. So it would take a lot of steps to rotate at the intersection from one direction to the other, one street to the other. We noticed that the agent was able to actually acquire goals even at long distances. The value function prediction of the agent was pretty good as well. So this is for a single destination. I'm plotting the value function of the different trajectories, and this value function peaks around the destination, which is what to be expected. We looked at generalization. In this case, generalization consisted in keeping some areas of a maze out of the training data set. So those black areas over here. And during test time, without any retraining, we would try to see if the agent could still go to those black areas, if we picked a goal over there. And depending on how small those areas were, it managed to do it somehow. So we assume that essentially it was able to take advantage of representation of a goal, which was done using those distances to landmarks, and to interpolate from known examples it has seen during its experience in the training data to the unseen areas. So it's essentially as if, let's say you learn to navigate in this room, but you were never allowed to come here, but you were allowed to go around this place. If I told you to go here using that presentation, you would still be able to, you should be able to do it because of interpolation. And yes, I mentioned that we tried to do transfer learning. In the transfer learning, the idea was very simple. We train different bits of a neural network for different cities. And then we can have interchangeable modules. So we literally trained one LSTM per environment. And then when we transferred this to the unseen environment, we froze the convnet, we froze the policy LSTM, and we just replaced the LSTM that was used for localization by the LSTM that would be retrained on that new environment. So this of course, is not an example of zero-shot or one-shot learning. We had to retrain the system from scratch, but we still took advantage of existing knowledge in the convolutional neural network and in the policy. And we managed to achieve transfer. And finally, I should mention some work by Jacob Bruce, with whom we have been working for the past year, who's a student at the University of the Queensland Technical University in Brisbane, in Australia, and who tried this method on a data set he collected by himself using a robot going around the campus. So he just used a Pioneer robot. And over a few days of data collection, he acquired all those traces of panoramic images, and we used that to define a sort of pseudo-street view environment in his own campus. So these are examples of panoramas he acquired. And then, at test time, he would drive a robot again, using a policy learned on the training data. And it worked. And he would drive in the same areas, more or less, but there would be visual differences, strong visual differences due to different shadows, illuminations, weather conditions, sunlight, raindrops. So these are examples of panoramas taken exactly in the same locations, but you can see that there is a little bit of visual, I mean, here there's a huge visual difference between the images, in the appearance. Like they are missing, I think some panels have been changed, there's rain here. So this essentially can be seen as an example of zero-shot test on the same environment, but a few weeks later. The agent that he built relied on a pre-trained convolutional neural network, ResNet 50. These are examples of trajectories at deployment time for a single go location. I think I highlighted here examples of, not all of them were successful. I think 10 out of 11 trajectories were successful. So one trajectory failed. And some trajectories that were successful were still suboptimal because the agent ended up taking detours. So I think that's it for the technical set presentation. At this point, I need to acknowledge the many, many collaborators I've had on this project, and this is only the closest ones for the past 4 years. And this is the list of papers that I've been presenting. Thank you much.